let's talk a little bit about bias, something that we all have, whether we think we do or we don't, we actually all do. And that's true for reviewers, it's true for individuals. All of us are constantly acting with bias, whether we think we are or not. The reason this came up was I was having a conversation on a recent Q&A call with channel Patreon members, and the recent video by the Headphone Show team came up. And if you haven't seen that video, they were talking about how their business model works. And I think it's quite a good business model where essentially the reviewers get paid to do the reviews, and that's all. They're not getting paid by any brands. They're not getting paid through affiliate revenue. They're not getting paid through any sort of situation where the review has influence over their income. So whatever they produce in terms of the review, they get paid the same amount of money because they're paid by headphones.com. Now, I don't know if it's a per review thing or if it's a salary. I don't know how that works, and it doesn't really matter. The point is that their review content is separated from the content of the review in terms of positive, negative, etc. And so in some ways that definitely removes some bias. There's no chance of bias towards a product with better affiliate revenue. There's no chance of bias towards a product from a company that might be sending extra gear or goodies or whatever it might be. And I'll come back around and talk about when and how that stuff does and doesn't happen in a minute. But the point is that that is a great model, but it doesn't remove bias. It just shifts bias. And that was the thing I wanted to talk about. And I think anyone that is looking for unbiased reviews, anybody that is looking for a completely bias-free opinion on anything, is kidding themselves, because it doesn't exist from anybody. And the reason I say that is that there are biases that come from all different directions, and we all have them. Whether you're a consumer that's bought gear, tried it at a show, any situation you go to, there are going to be biases going on. And the key, in my opinion, is to recognize and identify your biases so you can consciously work as best you can to counteract them. You know, think differently, challenge yourself, test the assumptions, test the biases. And so I want to talk through some of the biases that you might not be thinking about. So we've got the obvious ones where if somebody is choosing to accept kickbacks from a company, and I don't mean affiliate revenue, that's a different thing, but if someone's accepting free gear over and above the review content, you know, even getting free gear from a brand, that can be a bias for sure. You know, I am aware that there have been times I've received free product, so people have sent me product for review, and maybe it's the first time I've reviewed anything for them. There is very naturally the thought in your head that if you do a negative review, they might never send you anything ever again. Now, for me, it's not about the free gear so much as having content for the channel, being able to get more gear so that I can continue to produce reviews. That's far more value to me than any individual piece of gear. And I've talked about that before, so I'm not going to go into depth on that. The short version of that for me is that I am a consumer of audio products. I enjoy audio, I enjoy listening to gear or listening to music through the gear. And so for me, when I get a bit of gear given to me for free, I'm actually excited to try that piece of equipment. I'm not worried about its monetary value. I'm worried about whether or not I, as a consumer and an audio lover, are going to enjoy listening to my music through that piece of gear. And if it's disappointing for me from an auditory point of view, I'm going to give it a negative review regardless of whether it's sent to me for free or not. So as I said, I'm not going to go into depth on that one, but that's an example of bias. I am conscious of the fact that when I get sent a piece of gear for free, I am conscious of the fact that there may be expectations from the brand to deliver a certain review. There may be thoughts in my head around not wanting to upset that brand because I might want to make sure that I can get more videos for, or more products from them for videos in the future. There are lots of things that are biases that need to be considered. But don't think that anyone that's getting given products to review for free is automatically the only person with bias, because they're not. And I want to talk through a few examples of that. Now, I'm going to try and steer clear of the kind of psychological terms for a lot of these things, unless I can't come up with a better word for it or a simpler word for it. But just know that all of these things are very real things. They're written about in psychology textbooks, they're understood, there's reviews, there's studies, all sorts of stuff on them. And I say like peer-reviewed studies is what I'm getting out there. So one example here, and this applies whether you're a reviewer or whether you are an individual purchasing and trying out gear. It might be at a hi-fi show, it could be at a local hi-fi shop, it could be that you bought the stuff to try. And one of the examples is halo bias. So the idea of halo bias is that, and this works in any situation, if you find something physically attractive, and I don't mean that you're physically attracted to your audio gear in that sense, but the point is, if you get a piece of equipment and you like the look of it, you like the physical interaction with it, you like its non-auditory or non-audio properties, you are more likely, and this is all proven science stuff, you're more likely to have a positive opinion of its sound. I think a great example of that is the LAIV Harmony DAC. I think that is one of the nicest looking and nicest interacting devices that I've ever reviewed. And that was something I had to be very careful of when I reviewed it, so it didn't sway the review. Now, if you've watched the review, you'll know that I liked that product. I liked it a lot, but I also didn't think it was necessarily better than some of its competition, so much as on par with the competition, such as the shit Yggdrasil. And so that's an example where I could have absolutely gotten swayed into thinking it was the best thing since sliced bread because it's a beautiful looking and beautiful designed device. In reality though, I actually tested my assumptions on that. I took the time to do lots of critical listening, and I did my best to separate the sound from the design. Obviously in the review I talked about both, but the point being I needed to challenge my own biases around the fact that I think it's a beautiful device. And that's true for everything. If you have gone to a show and checked out a beautiful tube amp, you might have been enamored by its sound, and maybe it's because it sounded good, but also maybe it's because it looked fantastic and it had beautiful glowing tubes, and so you were biased towards wanting to like it. That's an example. I'm not saying you're all biased. I mean, we are all biased, but my point is, I'm not saying that everyone is deeply affected by halo bias. I'm saying that some people will be. Let's talk about a very different sort of bias, a much more seemingly objective situation. The measurement and the data around a product can create bias for you. And I see this all the time on forums. I see this all the time in some reviews where the measurement of the product, whether it's the THD, cyanide, other distortion figures, channel separation, where those figures have clearly influenced someone's perception, their subjective perception of the sound coming out of the device. On the flip side, or not the flip side, but in a different situation, I've also seen it with headphones where people have made up their mind about how a certain headphone or earphone sounds based on its measurements. And they've said outright that it's a bad headphone or earphone because they don't like the look of the measurement. But in actual fact, two different headphones and earphones that measure very similarly can sound quite different. And I've talked about that. I think the most recent example was the NF Audio NA2 Plus and NM2 Plus. They measure almost identically, but they sound quite different. And so if you went into listening to those, you could very easily let yourself be biased into thinking that either they sound exactly the same, and therefore you trick yourself into not hearing any difference, or you could decide that they both sound good or both sound bad just purely based on the measurements. So every possible thing that we know and can see and can think about a product is creating a bias, and that's the key here. Everything in audio is a subjective experience. When you're listening to an audio product, your brain is bringing together every possible thing that's going on around that audio product at that time, and that could all bias you. So it could be that you like the look of it. It could be that you think it's too expensive. It could be that you've seen the measurements and they're on paper they're fantastic. It could be that you just like or dislike that particular brand at the back of your mind. I mean, great example. I do know that I am more likely to feel positive, and again, I challenge this and I push back against this consciously whenever I'm aware of it, and I try to be as aware as I can. If I'm reviewing a product from, say, Gishelli Labs, Shit Audio, just trying to think of the other brands that I've had really good experiences with, Burson Audio, I've had really positive experiences with those brands, and so I am more likely to want to like their products because they're good people, they've been really helpful, and so I want to have good experience with their products. It doesn't mean I always do, and I will always test myself and check myself. And if you look through my reviews of products from each of those brands, you'll see that I am very conscious to actually say, hey, it's not as good as it could be, or it's not as good as other people say it is, if I think that's the case. On the other hand, if it's great, I'll still rave about it. Not that I tend to rave in general, but you know what I mean. So what I wanted to call out here was that bias comes from every possible direction. And we constantly have biases around the products that we listen to, whether we think we do or we don't. They are always there, and they can come from all different places. And so the upshot of this is there is no such thing as a completely unbiased review. There's no such thing as a completely unbiased opinion when it comes to audio, no matter what anybody tells you. All we can do, and I'd encourage all of you to do this when you're listening to gear, watching reviews of gear, even thinking about gear, is to start being conscious and thinking about what are your underlying assumptions, preferences, and biases about any piece of gear that you're checking out. So if you're going into watching a review about shit audio and you don't tend to like shit audio in based on your past experiences, that's going to be a bias for you. So if you're aware of that trend, if you're aware that you've historically not liked their products, you are going to have a bias against their products. And I just use shit audio as an example because I've been playing with some of their gear lately. Likewise, if you've got a perception in your head that HEADPHONE products are badly made, which I know some people do hold that perception, I don't agree with it, but some people hold that perception. If you have that perception, you are going to be in some way, shape or form biased against HEADPHONE products. And that's okay, there's nothing wrong with that. The key is to be aware of it. And the key is to be able to think consciously about it and to question yourself and ask yourself, does that really matter? Are you holding that against them when it comes to sound quality? Is it influencing your opinions on the product? Whatever the brand, whatever the product, those things are constantly playing around in your mind, whether you think they are or they're not. And so I just want to talk briefly about this to raise the awareness of it, to call out the fact that every single product, every single review, every single experience we have with audio comes with bias, whether we think it does or not. Just raise your awareness of it, question it, challenge it, and cut through some of those biases and assumptions and get to the truth of how you actually properly perceive those products when you start to strip away some of those biases and assumptions. So hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully it raises your awareness. If you're interested in knowing more about some of the various biases that actually play out, so halo biases being one of them, obviously there's obvious ones like the cost bias, the measurements bias, all those things where, and I'm using generic terms here, those are not psychological terms, but if you want to know more about some of those things that do go on at more of an actual psychological level, the known human biases, let me know in the comments if that's of interest to you and you want me to dive deeper. If it's not, that's totally okay as well. And hopefully this one's been interesting for you. So thanks for listening, thanks for watching. As always, thanks to channel members, to channel Patreon members, and to those of you that leave super thanks. And for now, I'll leave it to the music. Happy listening, and I'll see you next time on Passion for Sound.